Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to the latest edition of my Herald podcast. Now, later in the show, we'll cast a quizzical eye over Scotland's economic prospects, some new figures out. But one item has completely dominated the global news this week. It is, of course, Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover, the fate of the Afghan people, families, children, refugees, and, of course, the political recriminations both in Afghanistan and the wider region and around the world. Now, in a moment, I'll get the very latest from David Pratt, the Herald's Foreign Affairs editor. But first, we thought we'd bring you a few reflections on the crisis, a bereaved husband, then the Prime Minister, and then the Asia Director of Save the Children.
My wife is there. I got recently married and she's there. And my cousins, my uncles, aunties, they're all there. And my cousins and uncles, they're all musicians and they're very active and famous musicians in the country. Well, at the moment, they don't say anything. They're all so scared and shocked because the collapse was so suddenly. We wasn't expecting that collapse, the collapse that soon and that quick. Well, yeah. My wife was actually amongst the people at the airport yesterday. And there was some firings and she was just sitting next to the window. Window was broken and she got injured. Yeah, because of the glasses. So because of these stories that we heard about these things, she's very scared and I'm also very scared here. And at the moment we don't have so much choice. And I hope there is some kind of decision is made in favor of people like us in difficulties. And
she's entirely right. We will not be sending people back to Afghanistan, and nor, by the way, Mr. Speaker, will be allowing people to come from Afghanistan to this country in an indiscriminate way. We want to be generous, but we must make sure that we look after our own security. And over the coming weeks, we will redouble our efforts, working with others to protect the UK homeland and all our citizens and interests from any threat that may emanate from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, from terrorism to the narcotics trade. And I give way to...
At the moment, the situation in pretty much whole of Afghanistan is very dire. And I said earlier that because of drought, the number of people who do not have access to sufficient food has increased tremendously. We have 14 million people in Afghanistan who require food assistance. That is the highest number in more than a decade.
That was Hassan Noor, the Asia Director of Save the Children. Delighted to say I'm joined now by David Pratt, Herald's Foreign Affairs editor. Really poignant reflections there, David, upon the condition on the ground. Any latest information on that, on the condition on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, from what I'm hearing, Brian, things are beginning to unravel a little bit. I mean, I think you would expect quite an increase in tension given the events of the last week or so. But at the moment, there is certainly evidence that the Taliban are actually, I mean, it's coming both from the UN and from what I'm hearing on the ground, that they are beginning to track down so-called collaborators or people who have worked for the coalition in the past.
That's directly contrary to the assurances they gave when they first took power, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think this is something we need to watch, this dual face, if you like, of the Taliban, which they are masterful at in terms of presenting as a political kind of position on the one hand and conducting affairs on the ground in a slightly different way.
Now, what about the other assurances they've given, the assurances about attempting a stable government, the assurances about, in particular, the rights of women?
Well, again, it's early days in that respect. We're waiting to see how this plays out. I think my biggest fears at the moment, Brian, is that it's such a tinderbox situation that it wouldn't take much really for things to seriously start to unravel. There's been a lot of shooting around the airport today, as there has been for the last few days, but it has increased. And I think, women, the ethnic minorities, those that obviously felt threatened from the outset, will be feeling even more threatened at the moment. Meanwhile, in tandem, there are these political negotiations ongoing. Some of the old guard, if I can call them that, the Hamid Karzai, former President Abdullah, are meeting Taliban leaders to discuss the kind of shape and form of the future government. So we have to watch to see how that plays out. So there's a bit of a race on there. I think it would be good. I think it would be a welcome scenario if the politics sort of settled things down a little bit before perhaps events on the ground got out of hand. We're also seeing traces of protest at the moment, Brian, against the Taliban. And we saw it in Jalalabad a few days ago, which is remarkable, really.
But the immediately preceding government has basically fled the scene. You're talking about other figures, aren't you, involving themselves in an attempt to maintain some degree of stability, some degree of what passes for continuity.
That's correct. I mean, there have been big players, former president, obviously,
yes, indeed.
Former presidential candidate. So, these are high-powered, high-level brokering that's going on there. And the sooner that they talk things through with the Taliban and get some kind of calm on it, the better it is. But if there's, I think in the first sense, I have immediate concerns over that unraveling I mentioned on the ground. Anyone who's been in these situations, and I have on numerous occasions, it doesn't take much for things to get completely out of hand, and the shooting to really begin. The other thing we're not seeing, of course, is what is going on in remote provinces in Afghanistan.
I was going to ask that, Can there be a distinction between what is being said centrally to the world in Kabul and what is actually happening in Kandahar and individual areas around Afghanistan?
Absolutely. We're seeing it through the optic of Kabul at the moment, which in a sense is the stage in which the Taliban are performing, if I can put it in that way. What we're not seeing is what's happening in the provinces and the way they're cracking down there, these field commanders in those areas. That should be of concern, particularly if there is are signs of protest rising up in these areas. Something else I should mention too, Brian, is that there are, beyond those protests, there are signs of a resistance, perhaps fledgling resistance emerging. Because one of the things I don't think people are aware of is that despite the fact that the vast majority of the country is now controlled by the Taliban, there is a small territorial area up in the north, the Panjshir Valley, home to the legendary Ahmad Shah Massoud, who fought the guerrilla war against the Russians. His son, who goes by the same name, put out a statement on the Washington Post yesterday asking for international help and rallying supporters, Panjshiris, some remnants of the special forces and other menfolk who may be inclined to fight. So we could be seeing the beginnings of a kind of small-scale fledgling resistance in the north.
Is that something of an ethnic resistance against the predominantly Pashtun?
Well, indeed, the Panjshiris are predominantly Tajik, and they will be joined by ethnic minority groups like the Hazaras, of course, who are persecuted by the predominantly Pashtun Taliban, and have every reason to join that resistance. There is a historical, shall we say, tradition of alliance between the Hazara groups and the Tajiks, Massoud's people, and other groups there when they fought the Soviets. So there's almost a sort of resurrection, a hint of a resurrection of that. I should stress that it's just a fledgling hint at the moment, but it was quite a statement in the Washington Post yesterday by Massoud.
Well, is it possible, before we move on to global recriminations, is it possible to give any sort of forecast of whether this will be different from the 1990s Taliban? Is it a different being, a different sort of organization?
Initial reactions would suggest that it is, but again, I stress that it's early days. I think there may be two Talibans here, as we say, the one that's on the public stage and the one that's operating behind the scenes. It could even result in a split in the Taliban. Watch that space. That's something that's not being talked about at the moment. There could be those commanders in the field who feel as though, the leadership are moving away from the kind of original doctrines and kind of ethos and strategy. Could become frustrated with that, but that's further down the line. The main priority at the moment is the unraveling in Kabul.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk now about implications elsewhere, implications over the border in Pakistan. To what degree are individuals in Pakistan, the Pakistan state generally, they must be watching things with extreme interest in Afghanistan.
Pakistan has watched Afghanistan with extreme interest for decades.
Yes.
I would go as far as to say that they're frankly the villain of the piece here behind the Taliban. The Taliban would not exist without Pakistan's support, without the support of the Inter-Services Intelligence Director, the Pakistan Intelligence Services, who fund, support, provide sanctuary for the many fighters that operate in Afghanistan. Indeed, many of the fighters in Afghanistan, Taliban fighters, are actually Pakistanis. That's something a lot of people don't realize. So, and they've long wanted a government in Kabul that they can manipulate and handle. So the Pakistanis will be watching this particularly closely at the moment, as will indeed China and Russia, who have already been talking to the Taliban.
And let's talk about the US as well. The US president looking, well, let's go no higher than uncomfortable, but certainly looking pretty uncomfortable. But when it would appear that they got the intelligence wrong about the degree of resistance that there would be to the Taliban once the US troops withdrew, and he's now having to say, isn't he, that the US troops may have to stay there at the very minimum to protect US citizens and allies.
Well, again, that is a potential sort of paraffin to the fire. I mean, there is a deadline there for the withdrawal of US troops, and the Taliban, I think, would take a rather dim view if that deadline is not met, I mean, it was interesting watching Zabiullah Mujahid, the Taliban spokesman, at the press conference the other day. When I was last in Kabul and spoke to him on the phone, as many journalists did, without ever seeing his face, he constantly reiterated that point, that deadline must be met. US and foreign troops must be out of the country. Now, Biden and the administration might say they're only keeping them there to secure the safe passage of Western individuals and people they're trying to evacuate. But, it would be interesting to see how much flexibility the Taliban give them in that capacity.
Yeah, because they are in charge. They are in charge, aren't they? There's no question.
Yeah, and again, I think that's why we have to be careful here that, we shouldn't, as I was writing actually over the last sort of 2 days, we're going to be faced with this situation, depending on what face the Taliban eventually present to the world, whether the mask comes off and it's something rather horrible underneath, as we know they're capable of. But we will have to, at some point, shake hands with them, not necessarily apologize and shake hands, but we may have to talk to them in future. That's the realpolitik. It's the realpolitik that the West will have to engage with. And frankly, it's the realpolitik the Taliban face with, because they cannot function and run a government without outside assistance as a pariah state. That's a simple fact of life for them. So it's still early days, but there's an awful lot happening on the ground that we need to keep an eye on.
Let's talk about the impact on the UK government. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, and by comparison with the global calamity of these matters, it's a minor matter, but it is nonetheless a matter that is causing some problems for the Foreign Secretary. Could you explain that to our listeners and viewers, if you could?
Well, I think it's a huge embarrassment. I mean, obviously, Raab, suppose on a holiday. I mean, they seem to have been caught with their pants down, if you pardon the expression. It's not just a failure of intelligence that the Western US-led coalition had in Afghanistan recognized what was unraveling before their eyes. But, the UK is part of that coalition, a big part of that coalition. And, they've dropped their guards. And it would suggest that the politicians here have doubly dropped their guards. That's been evident in terms of the response at the moment. I think it looks bleak. This is a bad moment for them. It's also a very, very poignant, sharp reminder, despite the blustering of, the Tory government, that Britain is still a power to behold across the world. This has shown it in a stark light. Let's be candid about that, And indeed, I think the West will be reassessing its entire position over that. We've had a number of commentators on that recently.
David, how can I put this gently? I mean, I've covered news matters for a rather long time. You've covered foreign affairs for a fair wee while as well. Did you ever think we'd be back to this 20 years on from the Taliban being cast from power?
Well, the funny thing is, Brian, 40 years ago when I first went to Afghanistan, during the Soviet era and covering the war there, if anyone had told me that the Mujahideen, as they were then called, having got rid of the Soviets, would eventually be fighting, or a form of them would be fighting the Americans and the British who supported then the Mujahideen, although the Taliban are an entirely different entity. I would have said, you've got to be joking. So, anything is possible in this situation. It doesn't come as a surprise to me at all. I think it's come as a surprise in terms of the speed, the rapidity, the failings, but it doesn't come as a surprise. Afghanistan, as I've learned over 4 decades, Brian, is full of surprises.
David, thank you very, very much indeed. Great to have you on this podcast. And of course, we'll keep you up to date. David will keep you up to date in the Herald. We'll keep you up to date during this podcast, indeed, if there are any developments from Afghanistan. So watch the Herald for that coverage. Meanwhile, David, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that. Let's turn now from Afghanistan back home. Let's turn now to the Scottish economy. Some new figures out that prompted a debate about the nature of our current economy, about the issue of growth, and about, as ever, the issue of independence. I'll be getting a discussion on that with 2 senior politicians in a few minutes. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by my Herald colleague, David Ball. David, we got the latest JERS figures, didn't we? That's government expenditure revenue for Scotland. And we got some figures on tax. Bring us up to speed with those 2, if you would, please.
Yeah, so the annual figures, which were published yesterday, which take account of the first year of the pandemic, showed Scotland had a deficit between what is raised in taxes and that's spent on public services of 36.3 billion, which is a huge deficit, obviously. The biggest since these figures have been compiled. It's more than double the deficit last year of 15.1 billion. And that deficit is 22.4% of Scotland's GDP, with the UK rate at around 14%.
So a UK rate that's high, but it's very high by comparison with what we generally regard as being a 3% rate of being one of stability. But the Scottish rate higher still.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's fair to say that deficits across the globe have been raised because of the pandemic.
Yes, of course.
The widening of the deficit would be down to sort of more spending, sort of on business support and extra NHS funding from the Treasury, plus obviously less tax revenue coming in with the impact of the pandemic on jobs. Also, oil revenues fell from about 700 million to 550 million, due again to the pandemic and sort of the falling value of oil, which obviously will contribute big time to sort of Scotland's economy.
David, we got figures as well, a bit previous to the JERS figures suggesting the amount of money, and of course Scotland now has a different income tax system from the rest of the UK, the amount of money that is levied from taxpayers, but relatively comparatively little of that going directly to productive public spending.
Yeah, that's right. Some independent research, which was published at the end of last week, found that in the last 3 years since these sort of tax reforms were made, over 900 million in tax sort of came in for a net benefit of just 170 million over the 3 years. And the study kind of revealed sort of risks inherent to sort of tax devolution, where you mentioned we've got these sort of 5 bands compared to the 3 bands in the rest of the UK.
And basically the Treasury claws back the rest because the fiscal framework says that there will only be a comparable system to the previous system if Scotland's economic performance matches the rest of the UK, and it didn't. It fell short in terms of growth per capita.
Yeah, that's right. Essentially, it's being sort of propped up by the Treasury and that fiscal framework that you mentioned.
And the fiscal framework, of course, being reviewed at the present moment. David, thanks very much. Hang on to those thoughts for a second. I'm delighted to be joined now to discuss all of that, the economy, growth, the future of Scotland. Joined by Richard Thomson, MP, who speaks on finance in the Commons for the SNP, a very senior frontbencher, by Jamie Halcro Johnston, MSP, also a senior Conservative frontbencher in the Scottish Parliament, a spokesperson on business. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Richard, I understand the reasons for the JERS figures being bad, but they are absolutely dreadful. I mean, they are truly appalling in terms of. Do you think is it a blip? Is it something that can be turned around? Do we have to turn it around, or can we live with that degree of deficit? Richard, Tom.
Well, I think that's probably more a question for Jamie in terms of whether or not it's acceptable and you live with that, because it's all part of the argument that he, I'm sure, would seek to muster about pooling and sharing resources. But I think the point to make, as David touched on, is that in the pandemic, all countries' deficits have increased. And it was absolutely right that governments responded in that way, because without that government effort to maintain demand in the economy, we would have seen very, very considerable economic ramifications. So in that respect, what these figures tell us is no different from what they would tell you about any other country, just about anywhere else in the world.
Except that they're much higher. The UK figure of 14% is we're told the highest in Europe, and the Scottish figure within the UK is higher still at 22.4.
That kind of leads me on to my next point, thanks, Brent, which would be that if you were to carry out this exercise for all parts of the UK, you would probably find that just about every part of the UK was in deficit relative to London and the southeast of England. I mean, there are massive differences if you look at the Treasury PESA document in terms of public expenditure and spending between all the English regions. So through a combination of whatever their spending level is and what their economic activity is, you would find that most parts of the UK are in deficit relative to London and the southeast, which tells a story of a very unbalanced UK economy.
You would say that this is this is something that's happened on the UK's watch and is the UK's responsibility, not the responsibility of the Scottish Government?
No, I think it's very, very difficult to attribute responsibility when you don't have all of the tax levers that you might use and all of the economic development levers. But what I'm saying is it paints a picture of a very, very unbalanced UK economy that does no credit to the current constitutional setup. Now, I'm sure we can and will get into a discussion about independence round about this and what this might tell us. But I think there are a number of problems with using GERS as a proxy for independence. We can maybe dig into some of the detail on that later. But it is about, it does assume that you change absolutely nothing from how the UK spends, and it does assume an awful lot of spending takes place in Scotland, when actually it doesn't.
Thanks very much, Richard. Let's bring in Jamie Halcro Johnston. It's the fault of it's happened under the UK Constitution. It's happened on the UK's watch.
Yeah, Brian, I'm old and long enough in the tooth to remember when GERS were the absolute example of why Scotland should be independent for most Scottish nationalists. And you only have to do a little short Google search and you can see fairly senior SNP MPs and former ministers, and then ministers lining up to say, look, here are the GERS figures from 2000 or whatever, 2010 or whenever it happened to be. And here's what they mean for Scottish independence. They demonstrate quite clearly, and I'm sure Richard won't want to accept this, the massive difference between what Scotland spends and the resource that we raise in tax. And as a number of organisations, including some pretty important think tanks, have highlighted, if Scotland was not part of the United Kingdom, and I voted very strongly against that happening in 2014. We would be faced with a choice at the moment, and Richard's SNP colleagues would be faced with a choice of cuts to public services on top of what we're already seeing, or massive increases in tax on top of what we're already seeing. And let's look at the example that was highlighted by David in that, or raised by David in that. The increased flexibility in taxation, part of the framework, saw Scots taxed £900 million more over 3 years, to the benefit of £170 million worth of available spending. That's pretty shocking. And yet that was something agreed by the UK government with the Scottish government. So, we're not even seeing the benefits of that.
Richard Thomson, what do you accept that there is? I accept the point that GERS is notional, that GERS does not tell us, it was never intended to tell us anything about what might precisely happen under independence. But do you accept, as in 2018, the SNP Growth Commission under Andrew Wilson accepted that that Scotland endured a deficit and that would have to be tackled? Do you accept that?
I don't think it has a deficit in all years, but clearly in recent years there has been a deficit, as there has been in many other Western economies. I mean, just by way of an example, I mean, the UK has been in deficit for 63 out of the last 75 years post-war. So it's not unusual for governments to run deficits. Governments are not like your household accounts where you have to keep them in balance. Governments operate in a different way. But if you were to use, I mean, GERS was originally dreamt up by Ian Lang as a way, in an infamous memo to John Major, he said this could score over all our opponents, and it was intended at that point as a way of trying to stymie devolution. So there is some irony in seeing, and I'll perhaps excuse Jamie from this, seeing devolutionist politicians trying to now use it to stymie independence.
It was always political, yeah. But I mean, you make the point there about the deficit, but if Scotland were to seek to join the European Union, the figure there would be 3% of GDP of a deficit that would be regarded as acceptable for EU membership. We are not anywhere close to that and have not been for quite some time.
Oh, so it's Euro membership. The difference between joining the Euro and joining the EU itself And as long as there is a path that has been mapped out in terms of how you can do that, then I'm sure that is absolutely navigable. But I think to get into under the skin of some of these statistics, an awful lot of the expenditure that is attributed to Scotland and Gers doesn't actually take place here. It's allocated on a population share, irrespective as to the location of where that spend takes place, which grossly overestimates expenditure, for example, on defence. And it also means that there is we don't get the corresponding side of the balance sheet, a reflection of the tax benefits.
So you're saying economies could be made. Just talking about the real rather than the notional Scottish statistics, you're saying that economies could be made that would enable Scotland to get closer to some form of balance.
Well, I could say that, but what I'm saying is that Gers, by its very nature, is an estimate of Scotland's position within the United Kingdom as it stands, and it overestimates expenditure that is allocated to Scotland, which doesn't necessarily take place here. And as a result of that, it underestimates the revenues that would take place. So, as a snapshot of Scotland in the UK, it does what it does. As a proxy for the accounts of an independent Scotland, it doesn't tell us what people would like us to would like you to believe.
Thanks, Richard. Jamie Halcro Johnston.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening. I mean, defence being one of the issue that Richard raised. One of the things I've heard again and again from SNP politicians is how in an independent Scotland more would be spent on defence in Scotland. Well, the suggestion from what Richard's saying there is that it wouldn't be. That Scotland wouldn't spend as much on defence as the Gers figures. To remember, a Scottish government collated figures would actually be doing. So it seems to be a little clutching at straws here, and also slightly inconsistent with what the position has been of the SNP of what an independent Scotland would actually mean for spending. I mean,
let's set Gers to one side for a minute. Let's talk, Jamie, about those figures that you raised. The tax figures: 900 million levied additionally in tax, mainly on middle and higher earners. A slight benefit, I think, was described as marginal benefit for those on lower wages. What does that tell us about the actual condition of the Scottish economy right now?
Well, I mean, it tells you that the Scottish economy isn't performing, and what Richard and others, I'm sure, within the SNP will say is that they don't have the levers of power in the Scottish government, and that's an age-old argument. And yet we've seen economy secretary after economy secretary being appointed, delivering disappointing figures and then being moved on. I think we're on the fourth that I can remember in the kind of last few years. What it shows is that there is a huge amount of potential within the Scottish economy, but it is not being met by the policies or the delivery of the current Scottish government. And that's always been the argument and the position of my party, that actually we can do so much better in Scotland. But what we have to do is support business. And we've seen in the last few weeks real issues around how the approach of the Scottish government, and one which is a particular area of interest to me has been around tourism, because it's an area that I've been covering for some time, how parts of important sectors of our economy simply aren't being listened to and supported as we go forward. And we need a Scottish government that's going to start doing that.
Richard, what do you make of that?
Not much, Brian. And just to go back to the point that Jamie was making about defence, the point I was seeking to make was that amounts are allocated to Scotland for defence which don't actually take place here, and that exaggerates the nature of any deficit or reduces the nature of any surplus. But I mean, I think in terms of the fairly limited income tax powers that the Scottish government does have, over half of people in Scotland are currently paying less in the way of income tax than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK, and that's those who are on lower incomes. So there has been a modest redistributive use of those powers, which I think is
very modest indeed. It's very modest indeed. It's only 20 quid a year in some cases.
Clutching at
in many cases.
No, but it still makes a difference in terms of those on the lowest incomes. But
yes, but only 900 million goes in productive spending, Richard.
I'm sorry, I don't understand where that figure is coming from about productive spending and how that's being defined, because pretty much all government expenditure is intended to be productive. So if you can
because 900 million is raised is levied in additional taxation, and of that, the money is clawed back by the Treasury, because the Scottish economic performance is falling short of the rest of the UK.
Right. So in other words, that's about the function of the forecasting that's made in order to set the revenues for Scotland. I mean, I think that's probably misleading to call it productive spending, but there has to be that balancing mechanism. But again, I think that's one of the problems that we have. We have this convoluted fiscal framework, which is long overdue for review. And as an outcome of that review, I hope that there are more powers come to Scotland in terms of borrowing powers, in terms of additional taxes, which allow you to increase them or to reduce them or to rebalance the economy in ways that are more beneficial for Scotland than those powers are being used currently as part of the UK. So you can have a government that can be held fully accountable for the way in Scotland that they are used.
You call it convoluted, Richard. I covered the conclusion of the negotiations over the fiscal framework, and it was described as a triumph by John Swinney when he fought off what was attempted then by the Treasury to make further constraints. And we are now facing a situation where it will be reviewed. You would want further powers. The Treasury are going to want further constraints.
Well, it can be both a triumph at the time and convoluted in terms of the content of it. But nevertheless, having seen how it's worked in practice, I don't think there was ever anyone on the side of the Scottish Government or the SNP who would have been inclined to describe that as a triumph, who would nevertheless not have wanted more out of those negotiations. And hopefully, in light of experience, particularly through the pandemic, where there has often been mismatches between where needs have been identified and when resources become available, and you can see that particularly over the furlough and the confusion that there was for some time over whether or not furlough would be allowed to be extended if it were needed. It's much better to have full control of policy and resources in the one government in Scotland so that we can get on with doing the things that we need to do.
Jamie, you're keen to come in. Jamie, one point I mean to bring in, the argument that Richard is making there just tells you nothing about independence, and the, as he describes it, convoluted fiscal framework tells you relatively little about independence as well. It doesn't tell you how an independent Scotland would they would argue, your opponents would argue, thrive.
Well, I go back to the point I made right at the beginning of this. It told us all about independence when they thought the figures were supportive of independence. It tells you nothing about independence now that they show how important the union is to supporting public services in Scotland and contributing to making sure that some of the public services that so many people rely on are delivered. And despite an SNP government that's cutting or putting a real squeeze on a lot of local authority spending. And I would just go back to that point about taxation, because I think it's a really important one. £900 million worth of tax taken out of pockets of people across Scotland. Yes, there are some people who have benefited by a maximum of £20 per year. That's 0.1% for the lowest income households who are paying tax. And yet some people are paying well over £1,500 more. Now, you could argue, as many will do, well, it's absolutely fine. They can afford to pay that. That's right. But this isn't the people at the top who are necessarily paying that. It's some teachers and doctors and others who are being asked to contribute to that. And when we want more and more people to go into these positions, that's a real decision that they have to make of whether Scotland is the place for some of these people to actually to be, because there is more tax being paid. But I was just going to say, Brian, just to confirm very quick, reiterate, 900 million taken out of the pockets of Scots, with only 170 million pounds available to go back into public services. That isn't a good deal, and yet that's one agreed by the SNP.
Let's bring in David Ball here. David, I want to move on within the economy to another issue, the question of the continuing development of North Sea oil. David explained to us it's causing some contention, not least because of a potential field west of Shetland, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, the first case for independence back before the referendum relied heavily on the financial case anyway, on that oil revenue. It was seen as such a key thing to an independent Scotland. But not only now have we got the impact of the pandemic and the falling of the price of oil, but there's these environmental impacts where oil does need to be phased out, and then we can't have as much reliance on oil to the economy and the jobs that come with that. There's a huge contention, like you said, with this new proposal near Shetland, where the SNP haven't really said they're going to oppose it, but have told the UK government to think again, basically.
Thanks very much. Jamie Halcro Johnston, do you think that new field should go ahead? It is, of course, a UK government decision. Nicola Sturgeon has said it should be reassessed.
Yes, I do think it should go ahead. And I think Nicola Sturgeon's fence sitting to kind of, I was going to say lull the Greens into believing that she somehow is strong on this issue is going to convince no one. I mean, what does reassess actually mean? She's not calling for it to go forward. She's not calling it to be stopped. As I say, I think it's a play really to try and get that that elusive Green Deal over the line. There is a huge amount of work going in by the oil and gas sector. We recognise, I've worked with the sector in various roles for over a number of years, and I know that they recognise that things are changing. We have huge commitments to combat climate change, and the UK government obviously has put a £16 billion North Sea deal in there to try and transition out of oil and gas. But the simple factor is that the UK economy, albeit a major economy, contributes, I think it's 1% of emissions. We have our part to play, a huge part to play. The idea of closing down development and then having to import oil or import some of the products of oil, like plastics, which are used across the economy, including in part of the renewables infrastructure, just seems to be remarkable. And I represent the Highlands and Islands. We don't have the same density of people working within the sector as perhaps in Richard's sector, but it's 100,000 jobs across Scotland. It's absolutely vital that we continue while also pushing forward with the other work that we can do in terms of challenging climate change.
Richard, what's your take? Should the new field production go ahead, or should the oil be left in the ground, as those who maybe take an environmental perspective would argue?
Well, let me say a transition implies exactly that. It's not a binary shift from one form of energy to another. Oil and gas is going to be with us for some time to come as fuel and as feedstock, as Jamie says. I think in terms of Canbo or any other field, I think it should be assessed on exactly the same basis as any new field. And I think Jamie's maybe sort of slightly confused about this, but in the UK sector deal, which you referenced, which doesn't put a single penny on the table up front to help with energy transition, incidentally, one of the conditions it places on new oil field developments is that there is a climate change checkpoint whereby each new development is assessed against the government's climate change objectives in terms of meeting our continuing energy demand from hydrocarbons. And all that the First Minister has done is to ask that fields which had previously been licensed but where work hasn't started, such as Canbo, should be subject to exactly the same assessment process. That seems to me to be a very pragmatic and sensible thing, and I can't understand why Jamie would be in favour of that kind of climate change check for new fields, but not for fields that have yet to begin the beginnings of production.
What's your take? Do you believe that field should go ahead into production?
Well, different fields have different characteristics. And as I say, if it passes the same benchmark as any other field is expected to pass, then we have to be clear there is still a need to extract hydrocarbons and will be for some time. But at the same time, that's got to be part of a transition in terms where we're maintaining our energy security and meeting our energy needs, a transition to newer forms of energy, whether that's renewable electricity and newer applications for that, or, as I very much fervently hope, a transition into the hydrogen economy, which we're very well placed to be part of in the northeast of Scotland.
But Richard, as Jamie reflected there, as David Ball mentioned earlier, your party is perhaps about to sign a deal, an agreement. It's not a coalition, an agreement with the Greens and in the Scottish Parliament and in Scottish Government, and the Greens say leave it in the ground.
Well, the Greens can say leave it in the ground. This is a decision which, I wish it was a decision which rested with the Scottish Government. But I think when you're looking at the development of fields, let's assess them on the same basis. Let's have the level playing field of that climate change checkpoint, and let's see which ones pass muster and which ones don't. Because it seems to me odd that you would have this climate change checkpoint for any new exploration, but give a free pass to other fields which were maybe discovered some time ago where no work has been undertaken.
But you believe there has to be a field. Forgive me, you believe there has to be a continuing future for oil, at least during that transition period. How many years might that be?
Well, that could be for up until the point where we're looking to be at net zero, and it also depends on how quickly we can get other forms. 2045 beyond, we're still going to need it as fuel and feedstock even beyond then. Okay. So I don't think it's possible to put a date on ending production, because we will always need oil and gas. But I think the key is not to choke off the supply. We need that supply. The key is to change the nature of the demand, and that is where the government money is needed up front, and where sadly the sector deal is lacking.
Thanks. Going to bring in Jamie in a second, but David Ball, remind us where we are on that deal with the Greens. It looks like it may be coming to the boil a bit, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. The potential problem is the fact that the Greens members have to sort of agree to this before it is approved. But it is looking like in sort of the next few days we could at least get some developments on it, what that deal might contain, and then into next week, hopefully before Parliament comes back, we should know whether that deal is going to go ahead.
Okay, now we'll be talking to the Greens, of course, in subsequent issues of this podcast, perhaps even next week with a bit of luck. But Jimmy, your party is expressing concern about the implications of an agreement between the SNP and the Greens.
Yeah, I mean, I think this what we've perhaps labelled the coalition of chaos, the potential that a Scottish Green-led or Scottish Green-influenced SNP government, an SNP government that hasn't delivered enough for our economy, will be even more hamstrung by a Scottish Green party that will hold a balance of power, but will also be against some of the major problems. I mean, some of the sectors like oil and gas. I mean, I'm heartened that Richard is more supportive of the oil and gas sector than some of his colleagues, like Tommy Shepherd, and not Tommy. Let me clarify, not Tommy Sheridan, Tommy Shepherd, and others in his support for the North Sea oil and gas. I think as a North East MP, he really should be. But there's other projects like in my area, the A9 and the A96 as well. These important dualling projects that have been slow in their delivery anyway, and there's real concern that the Scottish Greens will be opposing those because they have opposed those in the past. They're not in favour of more road projects. So there's a number of areas like that that we have real concerns.
Richard, what do you make of that? What degree of influence would the Greens have over the SNP in government? I mean, you are, after all, in Scottish Parliament only one short of an overall majority.
Yeah, and I think any deal would need to reflect that. But I'm just having a little chuckle to myself, the idea of Jamie talking about any coalitions of chaos, given the experience down at Westminster over the last few years when the DUP held the balance of power with the Conservatives over Brexit. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The SNP is very, very close to being in a majority position now. That means it's a parliament of minorities. I think parliaments of minorities have worked very well at times throughout the history of devolution. Sometimes we've had formal coalitions, sometimes we've had minority government, and each has been appropriate to its circumstances. But I think the thing that has changed quite significantly from those heady days of 2007 and the minority first SNP government is that it's quite a fractious chamber from my perspective. Now, certainly Westminster's extremely fractious as well, but in terms of the ability to strike deals with other parties, there are parties like the Conservatives who were able to do deals with the SNP over matters to do with budgets and earlier, and they seem to have completely retreated from wanting any kind of influence in favour of being able to write vitriolic press releases. But if I was in government, if I was in Holyrood, it's about power, it's about decisions, it's about getting something out of your manifesto, and the Conservatives don't seem to be remotely interested in that.
Why a Green Deal now, Richard?
Jamie, please go on. Jamie, go on.
Sorry, Brian. Yeah, why a Green Deal now? I mean, this last Scottish government was a minority government. It didn't push ahead with some of its main priorities, but it pushed ahead with others. It worked with the Greens and others to deliver, and I have voted with the SNP and all parties on amendments to bills and the like. So why a Green Deal now,
Richard?
Well, you're in that particular parliament, Jamie. But I think
you're in that particular party. So
yeah.
I mean, Joanne.
I'm the one that's been asked that particular question. So I think you'd have to take an assessment of what the politics are likely to be. And I mean, certainly, I don't get the feeling that Douglas Ross is going to be in the mood to turn up to budget negotiations with a bottle of wine and a bunch of roses. And I certainly don't get the feeling that the Labour Party are in much of a position to negotiate. And certainly, I think Willie Rennie has been quite hostile in many respects to the Scottish Government. I'm not sure that Alex Cole-Hamilton, after his coronation, will necessarily be any more favourable. So you have look at the politics that's there and the deals that are there to be done.
Fine, I understand that. But Richard, what about Jamie's point that the Greens are they say leave the oil in the ground? Okay, we've discussed that. But they also say a halt on road developments like the A9 and the A96, relatively close in both cases to your own constituency.
I think there's clear cases to proceed with both of those projects on environmental grounds and on safety grounds. I mean, I think clearly travel patterns have changed in many respects post-pandemic. I think it's right that the projects are scrutinised to make sure we're getting the best value for the public pound. But at the same time, it's clear that the investment like that needs to go ahead, and certainly. Just to take the A96 as an example, we know it's a long-term project, but there are elements of that need to go ahead on the shortest time scale that they can. So I don't necessarily that's a project that is going to extend beyond the lifetime of any of the current Parliament, because that's the nature of road building projects. But in an environmental and particularly on safety grounds and economic grounds, I think there's very strong arguments for continued investment in both these routes.
We're almost out of time, folks, but forgive me, we're almost out of time. Let's give Jamie Halcro Johnston and Richard Thomson some final thoughts on how we enhance, grow, improve the nature of the Scottish economy. Jamie Halcro Johnston, first of all, what are we getting wrong, if you like? What do we need to do? Presumably, we do wish to grow the Scottish economy, or is that being abandoned as an objective? I don't know. But Jamie Halcro Johnston, what do we do to grow the Scottish economy?
Well, I think the first thing we need to see is a focus on the Scottish economy, rather than a focus on some of the other peripheral interests, such as independence, that unfortunately has distracted the Scottish government the SNP for far too long. So we need to see a focus on Scotland's economy. We need to see support going into businesses, which is based upon actually speaking with businesses. There's a real issue amongst various different sectors that they're not being listened to by the Scottish government, or that listening has not been acted on. That they don't feel that they've got the ear of government. They feel that the government will kind of placate them, but won't actually deliver what they need. There's obviously real investment needed in training, and that's something the Conservatives have been heavily involved in pushing in our manifesto. But some of the more the opportunities that we've seen actually coming through the pandemic, investing in e-commerce, making sure that our businesses are resilient and supported, that we've got people in the right places to do these jobs. So there's a huge amount of areas there that we can improve, and unfortunately that has not been the focus over the last 14 years.
Thanks for that, Richard.
Yeah, I think you can't dismiss as lightly as Jamie seeks to the fundamental point about who decides and where powers lie and in whose interest decisions can be taken. Because I think it shows that when the Scottish Parliament has more powers, it uses them wisely, it uses them for benefit, and we get better outcomes. But the main ways we take the economy forward: investment in infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure, not forgetting physical infrastructure. We need to do a lot to decarbonise our economy, whether that's transforming heating, transforming our transportation system, and the decarbonising the rail network. We also need to embrace energy transition, as I said earlier, in terms of particularly keeping the prosperity that we have in the Northeast and the talent, the human capital that we have in the Northeast, getting that into the hydrogen economy and industrialising the opportunities there. Because I think that the comments that the Prime Minister made when he came up to Scotland the other week about Margaret Thatcher, having a lead on the energy on climate change with closing the coal pits, will have sent a chill down people's spine about what that could mean if that same kind of approach were followed. But we need to embrace that transition positively. Also, we need to do more to diversify our economy. We need to be more of an exporting economy, notwithstanding the burdens that have been thrown in our way through Brexit. But we need to diversify our export base. We need to internationalise our economy, and we also need to diversify our domestic economy. In the northeast of Scotland, we've identified areas like adding more value to food and drink, doing more to develop tourism. It's lots and lots of little small things like that, as well as the big strategic issues, in order to make sure that we've got worthwhile economic, that we're making good investments, that we have a strong, diverse, resilient economy which is equipped for the climate and global challenges that we're going to be facing in the decades ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, Jamie, David. Thanks very much indeed for joining me today to discuss this. Any and all of these things might come up in the programme for government. I think it's the week after next, the return of the Scottish Parliament. We're hoping to do in just prior to the September return, intending to do a programme looking ahead to that. But of course, join me next week as well for an edition of the podcast. For now, from me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo the new.